Hi all, welcome to your first screencast. Within our unit of personality, we're moving on to measuring personality. So now we have an understanding of what it is. How do we measure personality to help us inform different people within the industry of a person that may be suitable for their sport? As always, take notes, make sure that you write down any questions. So as we know from previous lessons, there's not a clear definition of personality. There was lots of different ones. They did have similarities, but there wasn't one common definition that everybody could settle on. So if we can't define it, it does make us think, can we truly measure personality if we're not sure what it is? Now, we know there are means to do it because we did the EPI last lesson, but it did bring about some questions for us in terms of 3 different areas. So we have our 3 different areas: validity, reliability, and ethical issues. So the questions we thought about last lesson, if we don't have a definition, can it truly be valid? Can we measure personality? If the interviewee is saying what we want to hear, can it truly be reliable? Would they be able to repeat that same information? And also with any kind of self-report or personality measurement, it's quite probing, it becomes quite personal. So are we able to keep it sensitive enough and confidential? So moving on from thinking about that from last lesson, we have our options in terms of questionnaires, interviews and observations. So you have these 3 aspects to focus on through the syllabus and through questions. However, we do have different options in terms of the measurement. So although these are these questions, people have devised different means of doing things. So we have questionnaires, interviews and observations are 3 options that we need to know for our course, and also the 3 main options that are used by psychologists in the world. So questionnaires is our first one, and they are the most common means of measuring personality. Quite often it requires a self-report, so they're usually quite personal, and they ask the interviewee to, or the person that's answering the questionnaire, to really analyse themselves and create an idea of their own personal personality. They are the most common because they're quite cheap, they're easy to produce because they can be produced en masse, and also they're easy to administer, so they could be done pretty much anywhere. So, you know, a coffee shop, in the changing rooms, on pitch side, so they're easy to complete in pretty much anywhere. They also then provide plenty of data, so it allows the psychologist to get lots of data that they can analyse, compare, contrast and provide information from. However, there are other sides to the story, isn't there? Because it's a self-report, that is something that's quite difficult. If you think back to when you did your EPI, there were quite a lot of you who were asking somebody else for their opinion. You were quite stuck. You didn't really know what answer to put. So self-reporting is quite difficult. Therefore, you know, our respondent's going to say what you want to hear. Therefore, their reliability is questioned. But most of all, as we've said before, if we can't define personality, how do we know that a questionnaire is valid? So means number 2, we're looking at interviews, and most of the interviews are formed on discussions. Some of them are based on questions, some of them ask you to interpret drawings, but it's always a discussion form. Now, interviews are better in terms of reliability because they can go into much more depth than questionnaires, providing that they're asking open-ended questions. So instead of just yeses or nos, they're probing, they're asking, and they're requiring more detail from the people that they are interviewing. There are downfalls to that. Open questions can lead to kind of diversions, and it can take them off task. However, you know, it does allow them to probe and get more information from that individual should anything they talk about become more interesting to the interviewer. The other key aspect that we need to think about is the interviewer. So do they have a good ability? Are they experienced? Are they confident? Because that confidence and ability to interview someone will depend and affect the information that they get. So, for example, we said about open questions go on to diversions. Are they confident enough to let the interview flow and carry on to create trust with the interviewee and therefore hopefully get more detail? Or do they stop them and therefore create a barrier between themselves and the interviewee? Also, in terms of their ability, we're thinking about, can they analyse the information that they're given well enough to provide a good set of data? If they're not very aware of what's going on or they're not very experienced, they may not get all of the answers from the data that they require. Unlike questionnaires, can we really get a large data collection? No, possibly not. This time it's quite time consuming. They tend to do these interviews one-to-one so that it can be ethical. Therefore, if it's time consuming, it's also very costly. So those are our two key negative points for interviews. Our final means are observations, and this time we're looking at observations that focus on responses and actions of performers. Now, hopefully, to help the reliability of the observation, these responses and actions are filmed in natural environments. So the other two methods usually are artificial environments, and therefore you don't always get the true colours of the performer, as it were. Whereas observations, if they're filmed in natural environments like a training session or a game, you tend to get the typical responses and actions that a performer would give. They are usually recorded because they allow terminal analysis. Therefore, because they're terminally analysed, then also you can get more detail because you have more time. So differences can be highlighted and analysed, but that does depend on whether or not the performer knows the actual natural behaviour. So this is our question, our key question. If the psychologist doesn't know the natural behaviours of our performer, can they truly tell me what is typical of them and what is not? Because if they don't know what a typical behaviour is, how do they know when their personality is shining through? Usually your personality is highlighted when you do something different rather than when you do something typical. So that would be the key point for us to remember. If we don't know the person, how can we truly know what is typical of them within a situation? Again, the same as some of our previous measurements, this is very costly, it's time consuming, especially if we're doing them in natural environments, the time to film it, the time to sit down and analyse what we've seen. And it's quite difficult to analyse behaviour, A, if you're not really sure what you're looking for because you're not very experienced, but B, if you don't know the person, how can you analyse any changes in behaviours or responses that they give within a situation? However, in terms of reliability, this is our highest level because we're recording in a natural environment. Therefore, usually we would see what the performer would usually do rather than what they think we would like to see them do. Of course, that does depend on whether or not they know that the person there is filming them. So we will cover all three areas in a little bit more detail and do some exam questions on them when you come to next lesson. But there is a key thing to note, and make sure that you've put these notes down in your booklets. Examiners want to know the positives and negatives of these methods. They are quite often a question that comes up, but also they'd be looking to link these to attitudes and aggression and other things that go on within a sporting environment that might be affected by somebody's personality. But those are things we will cover later on. So make sure you've made notes, you have any questions ready, and you have the key advantages and disadvantages of these different means of measuring personality.